So for this purpose, I've been asked to talk about Loris Malaguzzi, the founding spokesperson of work in Reggio Emilia in northern Italy. Some of you will be familiar with his work, or maybe some interpretations of his work, because it's not always clear what he said or what other people interpret him to have said. But in any case, his work has been associated with something which has been called a worldwide pedagogical revolution in Reggio Emilia. Now, I'm not talking for this purpose about what people call the Reggio Emilia approach, which is a term I disagree with in any case. We're just looking for the moment at Malaguzzi. Okay. Now, in asking why I chose Malaguzzi from all the other people who've influenced me over the years and in different places, I'm actually going to quote him from an interview that is in the book, The 100 Languages of Children. This is the second edition. Some of you may know the yellow 1993 version. But when he was talking with Leila Gandini in this, he said, "There are some choices that you know are coming upon you only when they are just about to explode. But there are other choices that insinuate themselves into you and become apparent with a kind of obstinate lightness that seem to have slowly grown within you during the happenings of your life because of a mixing of molecules and thoughts. It must have happened this latter way." And his description of how he got involved reminded me very much of how he got involved in my life, just gradually over time. And I suspect that it's because of the person I am, the family I grew up in, where I went to school in California. I was poised, as a Berkeley graduate, to be influenced by Malaguzzi. Now, I'm actually a little self-conscious talking about him because there are still people with us who worked with him and knew him, and I would not want to be misinterpreting what he may have said. So I will try to rely on things that are in print. But if we talk about primary sources, we're a little limited because he actually didn't write much. He was very busy as a collaborative person working with a group of people, particularly for the rights of children. So I will refer to a few things, but in terms of giving you 3 points as to why Malaguzzi is someone we should think about when we are considering theories that influence practice in early childhood education, 3 things. I think he was a man at a certain place at a certain time. He's one person whose thinking and tenacity galvanized a committed group of people in Europe. It was post-war Europe, in a time that enabled a different focus on the rights of children, particularly working towards a more peaceful world. Some of the work that's evolved from his ideas appears to be about art. It's not about art, it's about peace. It's about problem solving and initiative and collaboration. And that's an important journey to think about when you're trying to see how this person fits into your collection of people who influences you. A second point would be that he's an elder statesman who's built on the history of many others who've written and thought about education and children, and in fact about peace. He has a history of working with scholarly thinkers to evolve a community of thinkers who continue to offer provocations to consider possibilities for the international educational community. As I understand it, he was never someone who said, "This is the way it must be," offering possibilities for us to consider. And I like that interactive, inclusive nature of the sharing of ideas, and I think that's something which is intended by the early years learning framework. So I think he sits very comfortable with that. The third point for choosing him as an important theorist for our consideration is that he's the author of a poetic encapsulation of the image of a child, which has provided inspiration from educators around the world, from the least privileged in war zones to those who are in the most elite environments. In the 100 Languages of Children, this celebration is produced like this. You won't be able to see it particularly, but what you need to know is that this version is in Italian and that he signed it. This is an image produced by children as part of an investigation. This version is in English, translated by Leila Gandini, who is one of the co-editors of the volume. Il cento c'è. No way. The 100 is there. The child is made of 100. The child has 100 languages, 100 hands, 100 thoughts, 100 ways of thinking, of playing, of speaking. 100, always 100 ways of listening, of marveling, of loving. 100 joys for singing and understanding, 100 worlds to discover, 100 worlds to invent, 100 worlds to dream. The child has 100 languages and 100 more, but they steal 99. The school and the culture separate the head from the body. They tell the child to think without hands, to do without head, to listen and not to speak, to understand without joy, to love and to marvel only at Easter and Christmas. They tell the child to discover the world already there, and of the 100 they steal 99. They tell the child that work and play, reality and fantasy, science and imagination, sky and earth, reason and dream are things that do not belong together. And thus they tell the child that the 100 is not there. The child says, "No way, the 100 is there." As my friend says, a poem can be theory, and that one has theoretical power. Of course, we all know that the idea of the 100 languages of children is not a list. There are not 100 specific ways. It's a metaphor asking us to think about the infinite ways that children have to communicate with each other, with us, graphic representation, transmission of their ideas through shadow play, through dance, through song, through poetry. These hundreds and hundreds of languages which Malaguzzi is inviting us to encourage children to use rather than trying to separate into thinking and play and so on, as he explains in his poem.
So in thinking about the link between my worldview and the theories that I've reflected upon in my early childhood practice, there seems to be quite a strong theme with the people I've learned from over the years. First, I think back, the things that I've described, of course, in countries other than Australia, where I've been and worked with children and families. But then here in Australia, right to my first teaching practice out of my Teachers College course, and that was at the Lady Gowrie Centre. So I was privileged in those days to work with women who I saw, especially even looking back now, had a very strong sense of the dignity and the reverence for children and for families. I didn't ever hear them use the language we might use today about justice and fairness and equity. But it was in their practice that I saw the real honouring. And every day after working with the children, the conversations that we had thinking about the next day always came out of what we saw as a phenomenology of what's happening with children and how we could support them, find ways to create an environment where they could take whatever was there forward or on or in another place the next day. So that idea of dignity has always been there. And as I said before, when I met the work of Rudolf Steiner, the same essence was there. And I really enjoy the quote of his about the educational setting. We want to receive the child in reverence and educate the child with love and let them go forth in freedom. Now, of course, this is a striving in Steiner education, as it is in every education. Nothing is perfect, and we as imperfect human beings are striving. But later on, of course, I found Loris Malaguzzi's work, and it seemed to me, when I heard him speak, read his writing, that this same theme of the honouring and the dignity of the child, and then for a bigger purpose, as it was with Rudolf Steiner, of creating harmony and peace in the world. And so I was immediately attracted to the kinds of ways that he saw we could create a space for children to be with adults who really understood what that reverence and dignity and really seeing the child the way they wished to be seen, at least the attempt to do so, was present. So that's was incredibly exciting for me.
And what's unique about Australia? Our culture.
Yes,
So
that's right.
everybody
Yes.
should have the right to learn about that,
Yes.
because it's
Yeah.
what makes this country unique.
That's right. And I know that when we do training sessions with early childhood staff, like they do want to learn about culture, you know, because even, you know, I know when we were going to school, it wasn't something that you learnt about in class.
No.
So for adults to actually be able to grind up ochre and see the different colours of and how special those paints that they make are, and then them actually being able to tell their own story using symbols and making up a design, and that's something special that then they can take back with the children, you know, to show the children that they work with.
And then they go home and share their story, don't they?
Yes.
They go back
Yep.
to their centres and share their story with the other people in their program. And it all, for me, I always think it comes back to everybody has a story to share. Everyone has a
Yes.
story. Your journey in life is a story of where you've been, where the people before you have been, where you're going, where your children will go, and getting goosebumps. And that's where the layers of culture come into, you know, the fact that those people get to grind that ochre up, and to know that where that ochre has come from, and traditionally that might have been traded or used in ceremony.
Yeah.
And it's not until someone explains that to you that you realise, that people begin to realise the importance and the significance, and that that you can be in urban Melbourne,
Yeah.
and yet there's an ochre mountain
That's right.
just
Just over
away,
there.
just over there, that our children have climbed on
Yeah.
and collected.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, you know, knowing wherever you are, you can have, there is culture.
Yes.
Everywhere is
That's
culture
right.
in this country.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you just have to work and build those relationships and respectful relationships to unveil and bring that into your program.
And I think it enables all children to try and overcome racism
Yes.
when we're
Yes.
including our culture
That's
in
right.
programs.
That's right. And I think as simple as children learning what the colours of the Aboriginal flag are. You know when I start a workshop with children in kinders, I'll start off by talking about, you know, what the word Aboriginal means and about the colours of the Aboriginal flag, and you know, and I've had teachers come, you know, give me feedback and say, oh, you know, Jessie went home and, you know, was in the back seat of the car telling her grandmother what the colours of the Aboriginal flag mean, and then that's that. You know, you've got intergenerational, you know, sharing there and learning.
Yeah.
It's really beautiful.
Because Grandma mightn't have had the opportunity
No.
to learn any of
No.
those things.
That's right. So I think all children having access, and adults, because it's, you know, I think when we're doing storytelling, the adults are learning a lot as well about our culture. And that's what I love about when I do the puppet show, Auntie Iris Lovett's story, you know, that they are hearing the voice of our elders. And from your, you know, the research that you've done, we know that that's really vital
That's right.
for, and that's what elders want.
Because that's
as well.
a part of our culture, I think, that survived the colonisation that we still do mostly. Respect our elders
Yes.
and ask our elders for advice and treasure their stories
Yes.
and endeavour to pass those on to
Yeah.
our own children.
Yeah.
And it's the stories of survival, isn't
Yeah.
it? That are just as important as our traditional creation stories of creation.
Yes.
Yeah.
If there were any strong key points that I wanted to make, it would be to look for the resonances around those qualities in the theories, in the perspectives that we read and we engage with, and then to really reflect and sometimes painfully reflect on what that looks like in practice. my kind of key thoughts when I meet the child is always, who are you, and what can I do to support you to become yourself? What is it that you want to do? And then, of course, I must question and engage with what will that look like in practice? How will it look if I say I really believe it's important that children are respected, that their views, that their ideas, that their longings are respected? What will that look like in practice?
The other theorist that brings to mind for me is Dewey, and there is a statement. Dewey has of course been very influential in early childhood, in the progressive movement where a lot of early childhood curriculum comes from. But one of the things that he said was that preparation in a sense means nothing, because we don't know what's coming next. None of us knows what's coming next. That the only preparation that actually matters is that we work in the moment now. So if we teach children fully now, with the hope that by teaching them fully now will mean that whatever they encounter in the future, they may be prepared to deal with that. They might not be either. So I'm not really interested in preparing children for school. I'm interested in teaching them fully who they are now. And who they are now is a very different person to who I understood them when I started my teaching career. That child was the developmental child. So teaching that child fully now was about supporting their development and helping them to develop social skills and gross motor skills and fine motor skills. Those things matter, but I also now know that I'm dealing with a child who is raced, who is classed, who is gendered, and that I need to deal with those things if I'm going to deal fully now. That they're learning about what it means to be a girl in Australia in my kindergarten. It's not something they're going to come to later on. They're there being a girl, learning about what it is to be a girl or not be a girl, or an Aboriginal child or an Asian child, what that means in that moment there and then. And I have a responsibility to deal with it. That's part of what curriculum is supposed to be about.
For the last 4 or 5 years, I've been traveling to a number of different nations and municipalities, including Australia, Northern Ireland, Africa, places in Africa, including Kenya and South Africa, and Ireland and Canada. That names most of the places I've gone with this research, and particularly I've been interested in children's not only rights, but their unmediated voices, how children are consulted for the purpose of research, program planning, and just checking in with kids when we do things in their name on their behalf. What do they think about that? So initially it was locating any language and policies about children, and then going to the municipal level. I imagine many who see this will be from Australia, and I'll never forget my visit with Kylie Smith to places like Port Phillip, where they were directly consulting with children in ways that actually made a difference in not just early childhood, early care settings, but in planning the link that a stoplight, green light was on for people walking, or planning things about parks and story hours for children as young as infants and toddlers. That sort of substantive listening to children and being embedded in a deep respect that they really have opinions, and that their opinions matter. Because they're younger human beings, to use Gail Canella's phrase. So that work has now refocused a bit on countries where children's lives matter, that have strong policies on paper for children, but a look with Valerie Polico on the other children in those settings. So going to Ireland and looking at travelers or Roma families, going to Canada and looking at refugee children and youth. These are countries that signed on very early to the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, but looking at whose rights and how do children see it, and how do they see their voices being heard or marginalized. So that is my current research project among several in Arizona. That's the international project right now. I'd say it's informed by a number of theories. Of course, critical feminist theory to some degree, There's probably even a little bit of Judith Butler in there in terms of what does it mean to perform childhood in various contexts? What does it mean to perform certain roles in daily life, and how do people see that? Certainly, it continues to draw from a post-colonial frame in that we're looking at places that have been part of or participating actively in various current and former empires, if you will, and then looking at the role of United Nations and other documents that have actually spoken to what it means to be a child. So there's a kind of a, I've called it over the years, a critical advocacy. It's a critical advocacy project.
And I've spent a long time and many years working with students around how do you do that? How do you try and create a way of working with children that focuses on their children's rights and the strengths that children have, and not focus on what they lack? And I've come up with a framework based on Maslow. Now, Maslow's a really old theory. You may or may not have heard of him. Maslow created a hierarchy of needs, and he said that we can't do things like dealing with learning if children's basic needs, food and security and shelter, aren't met. So he created a hierarchy of needs. I've actually turned that around and created a hierarchy of rights and said, all right, every child with whom we work has a right to adequate food, adequate shelter, adequate clothing. Those things are really important. If those rights aren't being met, then it's no good sitting down with the child and worrying about how the child's holding the pencil. We need to deal with those rights, those fundamental rights. And then we need to deal with relationship rights. Every child has the right to be loved to bits. Every child has that right. And again, it's no use sitting down and having this wonderful program on how to hold a pencil and write your name if in fact the child's rights for love aren't being met. That has to be our priority. So when we're working with children, we look at how are these rights being met and what is our role as educators in ensuring that those rights are met. So if Johnny is not having his rights for nutrition met, we don't just shrug our shoulders and say, well, Johnny's in our kindergarten and it's not my problem what he eats at home. If his rights for nutrition aren't being met, his ability to learn is impaired. And so we have to address those rights for nutrition. We have to address those rights for relationships before we then come into the rights to self-actualise, the rights to learn the academic skills and do the reading and the writing and get the fancy job and earn the big money. So I've done a book on this kind of programming approach which focuses on working from children's rights, working from children's strengths, what they can do, what they have in their lives. And again, using the Bronfenbrenner framework, because in our culture we tend to think of children as being responsible for doing these things themselves. Children's rights for food are met, we think, if children can feed themselves. But I've worked with multiple Asian families, and in Asian families, for example, the focus in the family is on how the family together create the rights. And so in one of the children I worked with, the child's sister would feed him. He was 4 years old and his sister would feed him. And the student with whom I was working was very concerned about this and said, well, look, I need to focus, you said I have to focus on these level 1 rights. His need for nutrition is being met by his sister. That's not appropriate. Therefore, I have to teach this child to spoon feed. And we sat down and talked about the context in which that child was living. And the student realised that by taking away from the child's sister her role as supporting her brother, she was actually destroying some of those very important family relationships. The bottom line is his right for food was being met. It wasn't being met by him, it was being met by his family. And in the context of that family, that was utterly and entirely appropriate. So it was not appropriate to develop a program to teach this child to spoon feed. We could actually say his rights at this level are being met. Let's move up the hierarchy and look at his rights at some other levels and work on those. So that mixture of Bronfenbrenner's ecological theory of looking at the child in that holistic way and looking at the Maslow and that hierarchy of rights to help us decide where we focus our energy.